heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 218, covering the week of June 1st through June 5th, 2020. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Glad to be back. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute. Like us on Facebook at Abbeville Institute, and subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition. It is a great book. It's something you're going to want. And again, it's free of charge. You do get our daily dose of Dixie, which is also back Monday through Friday, and our weekly email on Saturday or Sunday, which includes a link to this podcast. We're glad to be back doing all this stuff, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Also, don't forget that we exist on your generous contributions alone, so please consider a tax-deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute to the full extent of the law. Just click on that support tab on abbevilleinstitute.org. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift, so all of that does help us keep the podcast going, the website, all that stuff. It's all in the background. We're changing some things. We're doing some things, hopefully, to make things better. And in this current climate, I mean, even $1 a month would help. So you can donate however you want to, but just consider a donation. It helps do everything we do. We do have some other things we're working on behind the scenes. COVID-19 did some things to change. Of course, we canceled the summer school, but we're trying to work on maybe something else with that. So stay tuned. There's a lot coming. Also get your Abbeville Institute apparel. Just click on that support tab, click on shop. It'll take you out and you'll get our embroidered apparel. You've got the logo on it so you can talk about the Abbeville Institute while you're out there. And again, share our material out on social media. Be a part of the conversation. Now more than ever, we need people who are really dedicated to what's going on and watching. I mean, we've got some serious and dark times, I think, in front of us. And I don't know what's going to change that, but we are going to talk about it this week. So let's first get into some of the business stuff that if you like this podcast and you like the Institute, you might watch and see what we do. We didn't have a podcast for a couple of weeks. That's because I was in a transitionary period on some things and couldn't do the show. But we also, in that time period, I took the opportunity to work on some things behind the scenes. So we didn't have the Daily Dose of Dixie for a couple of weeks because we were working on our new backside of the website, which and some of the software we use, which I think has made things just so much better. Our donation page is so much better. Our email, I think, looks sharper than it did before, and it's a new service that we're using for that. So we've got some things that I think are really good, and your contributions help make those things happen. None of that stuff is free. In fact, it's much more expensive than what we were using before. But we hope this will keep us better engaged with the people that support the Institute, the people that do support the podcast, the website, the conferences. It will keep us engaged with you and will make it easier for us to stay in touch. One thing I would encourage every one of you to do if you listen to this podcast, we want to stay in touch with you. So give us an email address. When you sign up, make sure we've got your mailing address. We do have a newsletter we send out. Make a contribution. These are things that we want to do. Look, we're all in this together, and I know that's a catchphrase for COVID, but particularly with people in the South and the Southern tradition under assault the way it is, we're all in this together. When you look at what's happening in Richmond, Robert E. Lee's coming down. All Confederate statues by July 1st are probably going to be down in Richmond. We're seeing it happen in Alabama. A couple of monuments have come down in Alabama. Places you never thought would have happened. And you're talking about in Richmond some of the most beautiful statues that were ever erected. The Jefferson Davis Monument there in Richmond. It's going to come down. The Lee Monument is beautiful. Some of these are the most beautiful statues ever made in the United States. And yet, they're going to come down. And where are they going to go? What are we going to do with them? I mean, there is some talk about Maybe having a monument park or something established for these things that people can go visit. I don't know. But this is clearly part of the bigger plan, and as we're going to talk about in the material for this week, to destroy the South, or at least the Southern tradition, to eradicate it from American memory. And of course, it's going to do nothing to solve the problems that people are taking these things out and supposedly going to solve. And it's prophetic in a way that the first piece of the week, you have Clyde Wilson interviewed. This interview was done before George Floyd and all of the things that happened with that, and he had a very interesting comment in it. He said this, quote, as I get to it, let me scroll down here. He said this, quote, "Consider this. Yankee Minnesotans think that they have the divine right to sit in judgment on Mississippians and force them to do what Minnesotans want them to do. Now, it would never occur to Mississippians to dictate to Minnesota. It is not in their DNA, or rather, it is not in the remnants of their Western culture. They can go months or even years without thinking of Minnesota." Now, think of where all this stuff started. Minnesota. Minnesota. Now, what do Confederate monuments have to do with anything in Minnesota? The answer is absolutely nothing. Clyde calls this the Yankee problem in America, and of course he has a book about that. And he says this, quote, "According to Richard Weaver, Southerners still have a connection to the spiritual realm that makes up Western civilization, when the rest of the West has abandoned that civilization for materialism and rationalism. If so, this is a product of our history and not something we can brag about and take credit for. I've written a lot about the Yankee problem. By Yankee, I do not mean all Americans who are not Southern. I mean that breed arising from the deep North that has usually had the most influence and power in America since 1865. I know half a dozen Italian Americans who are simpatico with the South. Like Southerners, they have souls. They are products of a genuine culture. Good examples of Yankees are George W. Bush and Hillary Clinton. Yankees have no souls. They are creatures of material and abstractions. Consider the insistence that America is a proposition nation, and anyone who agrees with the proposition is an American. Can you think of anything more obviously absurd? Our country is not its people, its land, its way of life, its religion, its history. It is a slogan. The slogan is all men are created equal." That's the proposition nation, and we're going to address that in a couple other pieces this week. He says, now that is a very good idea that should govern the behavior of Christians toward other human persons. But there cannot be any such country. What is happening here is that a slogan gives power to those who see themselves as entitled to interpret it. And the Yankee always acts with self-righteousness, ill-informed, shallow knowledge, and the most stupendous hypocrisy known in history. This is the thing, the stupendous hypocrisy. We're seeing what happened in Minnesota. I thought there were no racists in Minnesota. We were supposed to have nobody up there that would do anything that was racially motivated. Now, the cop who did these horrible things to George Floyd, who treated him as less than a person, and the way that he held that individual down, we don't know what his intent was there, but if he was, he wore a hat that said, it had a racist slogan on it. This was the case, but I thought these people weren't supposed to be in Minnesota, just in the South. So what we've done is project the intolerance of Minnesota onto the South, and Confederate statues have to come down. This is just ridiculous. The Confederate statues had nothing to do with George Floyd or the idiot cop that essentially killed George Floyd. It had nothing to do with that. But yet, because we live in a slogan, we have to take down these statues. Clyde continues, part of being Southern is knowing that these people actually hate you for what you are. They have hated you ever since the first settlers came ashore in Massachusetts Bay. Southerners are loyal to and do their best for the United States, which we think of as our country. However, we are linked in a union with people who hate us. The hatred is not in what we are, but in what they are. I think this is what's going on here with these problems in America today. And why, this piece and what we saw over the weekend and now what we're seeing across the South, and it's prophetic. America is not a proposition that all men are created equal. It's a land. It's a people. So really, in reality, what it is, a people, land, way of life. The piece that we had on Thursday, God's Country Shall Not Be Damned, it's an environmentalist piece by Neil Kumar, but it gets into this. It speaks to this part of Southern history. And I want to focus on that just for a second and then get into the other stuff. But it's the land, it's the people that made the South what it is. Are Southerners a product of the land? Is it geographic determinism? Is it cultural determinism? I mean, what is it? Is it religion? Is it a common history? I mean, those statues represented a common history for the South. And people, look, nobody tours the North to go look at their statues, but people used to come to the South to see things. I've given the story about the Chinese that I had a supporter of the Institute email me and said, look, back in the 80s, I took these Chinese businessmen in Texas, and all they wanted to see was Robert E. Lee. That was America to them. I mean, this was the guy that opposed the Yankee Empire, which is why these statues have to come down, because they oppose the Yankee Empire. And we have to have this monolithic empire, one-size-fits-all, top-down, monolithic empire of material, money, and abstractions. This is what the South is against. It's why everything has to be eradicated. It's why everything has to change and all of it has to go away. And you have to create myths to do it. The Yankee myth of American history, the Lincolnian myth of American history. Jack Marcourt, one of our resident scholars in Japan, with his piece on Friday, the Yankee myth centers on, as this piece says, emancipate this. Abraham Lincoln, the noble savior of African Americans everywhere in the United States, except he wasn't. I mean, every time we have a protest, got to go to the Lincoln Memorial. Why? This is a man that wanted to deport Africans after the war. This is and into the end of the war. I mean, as Phil Magnus has shown, I think conclusively in his book on the topic, Abraham Lincoln was interested in colonization up to the end of his life. This is a man that said some of the most racist things you'd ever read. I mean, I wrote a piece on this. White supremacy is not exclusively a Southern ideology. Or is white supremacy an exclusively Southern ideology? No, it's not. So we're going to go stand in front of the Lincoln Memorial, a man that never considered the races to be equal, but yet he is the symbol of anti-racism in the United States. I mean, you can't get a bigger myth than that. But yet, here it is. And then you have Boyd Cathy talking about the egalitarian myth. This is the proposition nation, that the forces on the neoconservative right have adopted as their own. I mean, this is where, and this is what I talk about in the piece I wrote on Wednesday, the American Girondins. We have enemies to the South that are not just on the left. It's not just on the left. They're on the right. They're people like Harry Jaffa and Alan Gelzo and Richard Brookhiser and George Will and Victor Davis Hanson. These are considered to be conservatives. Even Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity bash the South. Why? Because you can, and because they've swallowed whole the Lincolnian myth of America. The one-size-fits-all, we need Donald Trump to run out and save us all. The Republicans in Congress to say, well, why should anyone, I had a friend of mine ask me, why should anyone vote Republican anymore at all? What's the point? I mean, they hate you just as much as the left does, particularly those that are in power, and they'll break, they'll bend, they have no spine. So why vote that anymore at all? Why not? I mean, why vote for any of these people? Clyde brings that up. He says, consider the South does not have a single representative in the U.S. Congress today. He says we have people that represent the Republican Party or Democrat Party. In the 1960s, when Southerners were kicked out of the Democratic Party, if only our leaders had formed a Southern party rather than opportunistically joining the Republicans, who had always been unrepentant enemies of the South and still are. Of course, Clyde's point about what should we do with the South, he says the only real Southern cause is preserving and perpetuating the Southern people in a maliciously hostile environment. That will require an increasingly sense of unity as Southerners. It's not primarily a political thing, yet unavoidably self-government and freedom require political power. So that's where people get wrong. I mean, this whole thing is not about politics. And even at the end of Boyd Cathy's piece that we ran on Tuesday, The Egalitarian Myth in Secession, he brings up, maybe it's time for secession. He says, I've written previously about the potential, even probable breakup of the creaky old American nation. What has happened on the streets of major American cities in recent days has far less to do with an imagined institutional racism than with the fact that there is no longer anything other than perhaps geography that binds us all together. A decreasing portion of our citizenry still believes in the old traditions and standards and in the natural law that produced our fragile experiment in constitutional republicanism. But a large and growing portion rejects that inheritance and has joined the immemorial rebellion against God and nature. Between the two, there can be no peace. In such a conflict, one side must win, the other lose, either that or they must separate. No nation can continue this way for long. No nation can avoid the essential questions in the ironclad laws of nature itself. He says, ironic, isn't it? Abe Lincoln pushed the United States into a war to suppress the South in the name of union. But what he really did was to set into motion the conditions for the massive disturbances and disunion now spiraling out of control, which cannot be stopped. And I think this is true. What people are experiencing now is a reaction to years of being told that America is an evil place. And the people that have been pushing that tremendously are still those on the right, because it's the South as the scapegoat. The South is evil. Well, if the South is evil, so is George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, and every other, James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, Zachary Taylor. I mean, you go down the list. William Henry Harrison, all these people, John Tyler, they're all evil. Like even Abraham Lincoln has to be evil because he was Southern, born in Kentucky. At least that's what the narrative always was. Here's a moderate Southerner. So we have all of this going on. All of this happening. And the point of it is always we have to criticize the South. This is why Confederate statues have to come down, because if you just get rid of those, well, then all of that will exorcise all those demons, and then we can just start moving forward and healing in America. Those statues were actually put there as part of healing in America. Healing from a war that killed 1 million people. 1 million people. If anyone should have been violent against and protesting Confederate statues, it should have been Union soldiers who were either shot at, maimed, or their friends were killed by the men that those statues were honoring. Yet you know what? Union soldiers showed up in droves, veterans showed up in droves at these Confederate statue unveilings and said, look, these people are our countrymen. Welcome back. They can honor their heroes. We'll honor them too. They honor ours, we honor theirs. But no, that's no longer the case. It cannot be the case because we live in a culturally destructive America. And that culture that's being destroyed is the South, and it's done in the name of one-size-fits-all policies and one-size-fits-all proposition nation mythology. I mean, look, we all know, as Jack points out in his piece on Friday, that Lincoln didn't go to war to free the slaves, but you had to do something else. And so the war becomes the effort to free the slaves, and that means all Southerners are fighting to keep slaves. Well, was that the case? Certainly some Southerners were. We know that most Southern soldiers didn't own slaves, so what slaves are they fighting to keep? You can say, well, they're fighting to keep a racially segregated society, a racially stratified society. That was the same case in the North. As I point this out to people, look, you had 2 slaveholding republics. Slavery hadn't ended in the United States until 1865. You still had slave-owning states in the United States. The North was still racially stratified. You had states in the North that didn't allow blacks to live there. Is that not a racially stratified slave-holding republic? So where's the difference? And if you say that, well, no, you can't say these things because the Northerners were good and Southerners were bad. You have to have good guys and bad guys. And the South has taken the bad guy position. And because the South has taken the bad guy position, it must be reformed and eradicated. It has to go. Ralph Northam, Grand Wizard Northam, the man that was on camera in a Ku Klux Klan outfit or in blackface, we don't know which one is him, is now the holy savior of all that is good in society because he's going to take down some statues. Now, I wrote a piece about this. Right after the Democrats won the legislature in Virginia, I said this will be one of the first things they do. They're going to talk about all these pie-in-the-sky things, but guarantee it, one of the first things they pass is legislation to take down Confederate monuments. And guess what? I was right. Because you see, if you get rid of those, you get rid of everything evil that's in Virginia, and it has to end. So the Lincoln myth that's perpetuated by people like Allen Guelzo and people like Victor Davis Hanson and others who have Guelzo has taken I think he's at Princeton now. Princeton's trying to hire quote-unquote conservatives, but he agrees with them. He agrees with their second American revolutionary thesis leading into now a third revolution. These people are going to be the useful idiots for the left. They're going to use them, and then they'll discard them when they don't need them anymore. Because they have accomplished their cultural revolution. Pat Buchanan talked about this in the 90s, and of course we saw it in the 60s and the 70s, but Pat Buchanan talked about it in the 90s. We're facing a cultural revolution. But most Americans in the 1990s didn't see it. They're seeing it now on TV because they're seeing the destruction in the streets in major American cities, the horrible things that are happening. They're seeing it. And I'm aware that a lot of these protests are peaceful and that looting and vandalism is not taking place. But the call to remove everything Southern from the public sphere, they haven't made the flag illegal yet, but that's, I'm sure, coming either by law or essentially it's become illegal just by act. De facto illegal because you can't have it anywhere anymore. I saw somebody post on social media, now if we can just get rid of that flag on I-95 as we ride down. Well, the fact is that flag is on private property and you can't. But I'm sure this is where they're going to want a law that says you can't publicly display that flag even on private property at all. It will become illegal, like it was in Ireland. To fly the green flag, the 1798 green flag, that flag became illegal. You couldn't have it, so people had to have it indoors. It was like a little club. You had to show the flag. And, of course, the thing was, you can make the flag illegal, but as long as you write the songs and tell the history, it's going to be fine. I don't know how that's going to work. Southerners have stopped even writing the songs that are pro-Southern anymore. It's just country music nonsense when they go, we're proud to be Southern. But what does that even mean? We're proud to have NASCAR and drink beer. And that's Southern. How's that even Southern anymore? What do these things even mean? This is the questions that we ask for the Southern tradition. What is the Southern tradition? What does it mean? We are going to have more parts of the Clyde Wilson interview in the next 3 weeks. And of course, we've been publishing the series on poetry. We took a break from that, poetry and music, which are vital components of a people and a culture. And Clyde has been presenting a series on poetry, which has just been outstanding. And of course, I've been behind a series on music, Southern Rock for the Apocalypse. These are important parts of what it means to be Southern. I do say that you can take all the statues down and all the symbols and everything else. And I do believe all those things will be gone. I think at some point in the next 5 years, you're going to see most Confederate statues, older statues across the South, gone. You can take all that stuff, but if you really can't take away the Southern tradition or the South as long as these things, what makes those things important, continue to exist. When Southerners seceded in 1861, they had no symbols. They had no statues. They didn't have any of that. They just had a people, and they were people of a place. And that was important. It was important enough, and they had enough to do it. They didn't have any of these other things. So you can take away all that stuff, as long as the people still survive, and the cultures and the traditions still survive. Symbols don't matter. It's sad, and it's destructive, and it's something that we should oppose, and hopefully they'll be preserved somewhere where people can go see them. And I almost guarantee you that if there ever was a monument park created for Confederate statues, it would be one of the most visited places in the United States. People would go to it to visit it and to see it. Now, you're going to have to, I think, fence it off to where you don't have vandals going all the time and try to destroy it, because, we've got Americans that don't respect property. And the thing about that, I remember when I was in college, This is something that's not new in terms of vandalism. And of course, if you try to get rid of graffiti and other things, now you're considered to be, racist. I mean, that's now going around social media. But I remember when I was in college, I was there and there was a couple of guys there, and they used to do things called tagging. And I understood the vandalism, the property destruction. I just didn't understand those things. I didn't grow up abusing public property. But they would go around with permanent markers and other things and write on stuff. I just didn't understand it. You didn't abuse public property in that way. You didn't do those things. That's vandalism. But now that's become, you have to vandalize. This is what people do. And you look at these protests, and a lot of the people doing this are white middle-class Americans. And again, because they believe in the proposition nation and nationalism and all these things. So, this is interesting, all the cultural dynamics that are taking place in America. From an outside perspective, it's interesting. Of course, it's destructive. And what do you do about it? And I think decentralization is the only way to look at it. Look, we've lost. When the neoconservatives, what I call the social justice conservatives, are controlling the narrative on the war, we've lost, and they are. Watch the Grant miniseries that was produced by the History Channel with Leonardo DiCaprio. And Alan Gelzo was prominent in that. It's all about, Reconstruction was, it's Eric Foner is the authority on Reconstruction. Eric Foner, the communist. Eric Foner, the guy that really hates the South. He does. That's the guy we're going to turn. This is why I've said history is really just interpretation. But that's the guy we're going to turn to about Reconstruction, Eric Foner. It's amazing. I remember, again, in graduate school, in a Reconstruction seminar, the professor there said, look, when Eric Foner came in, the entire narrative of Reconstruction changed. It became narrowed. Nobody could dispute it because Foner controlled so much. And the Dunning School, for all the things that people criticize it for, was actually more comprehensive when it came to Reconstruction and what we should be looking at than Eric Foner. But of course, the Dunning School is out of fashion. I would recommend Philip Lee's book on Reconstruction, Southern Reconstruction, any day of the week over Eric Foner. Foner has his biases, as did the Dunning School. Everyone does, and this is what history is. That's why it's interpretation of the same material. And that's where we are. But the neoconservatives have bought Foner's interpretation of Reconstruction. Of course, that's factored into what we think about America and Confederate monuments and everything else. And so all that has to come down. It all has to go away. It's dissident. It's not in line with the Yankee view of America and American history. All that has to be changed. So this is why when we have pieces like Boyd's on the egalitarian myth, and we talk about decentralization, mine on the American Girondins, Jack's on Emancipate This, and how important it is to understand the real motivation behind the Emancipation Proclamation. We've got these interviews, with Clyde Wilson and this piece on Southern environmentalism and how that tying to the people. We have to keep the people alive, and this idea of a Southern people alive, the concrete notion of a Southern people alive. And what is that? What is Southern culture? This is what we do here to try to keep these things going so that they're there for future generations. All right. Well, it's good to be back. It's great to be back in the saddle. Great to be back podcasting again. I know and we went a couple of weeks without it, but we will be back on a regular basis now. We've got some things worked out, and hopefully you're enjoying that content. We kept content running even when the podcast wasn't there, and we kept things going, but we just weren't doing the email blast and the podcast for a couple of weeks as we got some things hammered out, and I took care of some things in my own life. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.